Frank Zhang is a character from the Heroes of Olympus and the Trials of Apollo series. He's also one of the demigods from the Prophecy of Seven, and he plays a major role in the books. One of the most important moments in Frank's character was a powerful scene in the 4th book of the Trials of Apollo series, or the Tyrant's Tomb. Here, Frank decides to sacrifice himself to save Camp Jupiter from Commodus and Caligula. Frank took his wooden stick and burned it to trigger the bombs in the cave he had set up to kill Caligula, and this was a huge moment for him. This wooden stick that he used was given to him on the night of his birth by Hera, and he was told that his life depended on the stick. This meant that if the stick burned entirely, Frank would die along with it. So with this idea, Frank burning his firewood to kill Caligula was a decision that guaranteed his death. He chose to sacrifice himself to save everyone, and for a few chapters, Rick made us all believe that there was no way Frank would have survived until Frank actually did. All of the readers were stunned at Frank's survival. Some were happy that Frank didn't die, while others were actually quite upset with Rick for making Frank live. They claimed that Rick should have killed Frank to add more gravity to the situation and emotionally impact Apollo, just like what Apollo experienced with Jason's death in the burning maze. From this discussion, one common idea came up, and that was the thought that Frank's survival doesn't make any sense. When I read A Tyrant's Tomb for the first time, I actually agree with this idea. But to be honest, I was more relieved that Frank was alive because he's a favorite character of mine, and I was still grieving Jason's death from the previous book. So for me, seeing Frank alive was a good thing, but I did sort of question it. Looking back at it though, I understand that Frank's survival didn't make any sense realistically, but it did work for a more poetic standpoint. In this video, I'll be expanding on this idea more and explaining the real reason I think Frank survived in the Tyrant's Tomb. As expected, there will be spoilers following this, and with that, let's get into it. So let's start about how Frank died in the first place. I've already mentioned it earlier, but I'll be explaining more about the situation in Camp Jupiter here. Around this time, Camp Jupiter was at war against Triumvirate Holdings, an organization of 3 evil Roman emperors. The Triumvirate wanted one thing, and that was to control the oracles and prophecies so that they can rule the world. So from the first 3 books of the Trials of Apollo series, Apollo managed to stop the emperors from getting the 3 oracles, but one of the last oracles that they can still control was the lost Sibylline books. These books were lost in a fire, but the only person who has access to the information in these books is a harpy named Ella. Ella has lived in Camp Jupiter with the Romans ever since the Son of Neptune, and the Triumvirate declared war against Camp Jupiter to get to Ella. So with this threat, Frank was tasked to defend the Legion as praetor. When the battle finally arrived, it was brutal to the Romans, and it led up to Frank challenging Caligula and Commodus to single combat. Originally, Frank was to fight both of them, but Apollo couldn't handle it and offered himself to fight Commodus. Frank took on Caligula, and it led up to the sacrifice scene I mentioned earlier. The place exploded, and everyone is convinced that Frank died. However, after the battle, we see Frank weak yet alive, being dragged by Hazel's horse Aryan. Frank says hi, and then he just falls on his face. He's brought to the infirmary after this, and once he's conscious, Frank, Hazel, and Apollo talk about what happened. Apollo then gives the audience a painfully short reason for Frank's survival. Apollo tells us that Frank survived simply because of the idea that Frank chose to change his fate and didn't fear death anymore. Like, that's it. This line is the only explanation we get, which prompts readers to think that it was such a cheesy excuse for plot convenience. Though I can't deny that this is a possible interpretation, I'm looking at it in a different light now, and it has something to do with Frank's fatal flaw and personality. So let me explain, and for this, we had to head back to the Son of Neptune, the 2nd book of the Heroes of Olympus. Here, Frank was a very different person from who we knew in the Tyrant's Tomb. Frank was shy and awkward, and he had very low self-confidence in himself. In fact, many chapters in the Son of Neptune express just how much Frank hated himself for being a clumsy mess. This made him panic sometimes in the different quests he faced in the Heroes of Olympus, and what only made it worse was his firewood curse. Frank was so self-conscious about his firewood, and he was worried about dying almost all the time in the books. However, the quest Frank, Hazel, and Percy faced in the Son of Neptune changed Frank's character quite a bit. This was his first quest, and he had a talk with his dying grandmother and his father Ares. Both of them told Frank to stop being insecure about himself and embrace who he was, something Frank really needed to hear during this time. Though it was hard for Frank to accept and love himself better, Frank decided to take his family's advice. He managed to overcome the fear of dying for a bit when he decided to use his firewood to free the god of death, Thanatos. This was the moment when Frank said his signature line of, "If I'm going to burn, I might as well burn bright." This was a powerful scene to read about, because after being insecure all throughout the book, Frank managed to step up as the hero to save everyone. This moment was the key to Frank's further character development from there. He grew stronger in the 7th journey in the Mark of Athena, and though his self-esteem issues were still there, he was starting to see the better side of things in the House of Hades. Around this time, Frank had endured monster after monster attack from the 7th journey, but life gave him another challenge. Hazel was poisoned, and Nico was turned to a houseplant after an attack on Venice, and it was up to Frank to save them. Frank was given the blessing of Mars, and it changed Frank for the better. Frank became a beast in battle, and he managed to save Hazel and Nico from there. This moment just shows how strong Frank really was deep down, and how much he underestimated who he was as a person. He thought it was hopeless to save Hazel and Nico, until he came up with an idea to save them. This is further supported by the battle at the Necromantion, and Frank was promoted to Praetor by Jason. Frank transformed from this point because he led the army and became an unstoppable warrior. Frank was gaining even more of the needed confidence and love for himself, things he lacked so much in the previous books. Moving forward from this book, Frank was a changed person. He wasn't the shy and awkward kid we used to know in the Son of Neptune, and instead, he was a leader who everyone looked up to because of his strength and trust in himself and others. He was so brave that he would do anything to defend his camp and the people he loved. And this brings us to the moment in the Tyrant's tomb. Frank, as we all know, made a huge sacrifice to save the camp, and it was a noble act for his people. He almost died for them, overcoming his fear of death and self-doubt, as Frank was finally sure of his decision when he sacrificed himself. He knew that he was about to die, but he didn't care about it, and instead accepted his fate instead of running away from it like he always did in the Heroes of Olympus. He used his firewood curse as a strength instead of a weakness he was tied to, and I bet this was a lesson that Hera wanted Frank to know. Frank was gifted with so many powers and abilities, yet his fate was dictated by the lifeline of a stick. It's an ironic concept to think about, and for years, Frank was terrified of his fate being this fragile. It was a constant insecurity he held, and it almost controlled his life until he finally gave way and accepted who he was and that sacrifice he made. So in some way, Frank realized his true fate of saving everyone was the key of getting rid of the curse that held him back for so long. Though it doesn't seem that realistic to happen, I think it's sort of beautiful to think that Frank finally overcame the one thing that kept dragging him down, and his survival of that moment just gave him another chance to live his life without that burden. It was like a redo of what he already started after winning against the biggest challenge of his life, and I think all that is the real reason Frank survived. He managed to beat his fatal flaw and grow from there, something that Hera and the Fates admired, which is why they allowed him to live one last life of happiness with the people around them. And now, let's sum up this video. Frank Zhang was a character who had a constant battle with himself. He had low self-esteem, and he didn't see himself as someone worthy of leadership or trust. He was fated to die at the same time as a piece of firewood, and for years, he was terrified of his death. He was always self-conscious about it, and worried about everything around him, until he was given the right moments and confidence to build himself up. Frank became a leader whom everyone looked up to once he finally found his voice and inner bravery. His sacrifice proved that he was indeed a hero who would die for the greater good of everyone. Though his survival is a bit questionable logically, what matters best is that Frank finally overcame the biggest obstacle life ever gave him, his fear and fatal flaw, and I think that's why Frank survived. He proved the Fates wrong by choosing and taking control of his life after being insecure and unsure of himself for years. He changed for the better, and surviving that explosion just opened up another door for him for new adventures without the firewood curse nagging in the back of his head. The Fates and Hera gave it another chance at living, and it looks like Frank's ready to take on it. So how about you? What do you think of Frank's curse? Let me know in the comments down below.